The summer of 1944 was supposed to be Germany's proving ground. For years, Hitler's generals had mocked the Allies for their so-called inferior tanks. Whenever the name Sherman was mentioned, German officers smirked. To them, the M4 Sherman was nothing more than a Tommy Cooker or Ronson lighter, a boxy steel machine that burst into flames with the first hit from a German 88mm gun. In the tank duels of North Africa and on the Italian front, German Panthers and Tigers had shown what they could do, swatting Shermans aside like toys. And so, in the war rooms of Berlin, the Sherman became the butt of jokes. Clumsy, under-armored, undergunned, they said. German propaganda painted it as a rolling coffin, and generals like Heinz Guderian and even Rommel himself dismissed it as little threat to the Reich's armored might. But beneath this arrogant laughter lay a dangerous blind spot. For while German engineers obsessed over creating bigger, heavier, more powerful tanks, marvels of engineering like the Tiger I and the Panther, the Americans were perfecting something else entirely. The Sherman wasn't designed to win duels one-on-one. It wasn't designed to terrify by sheer size. It was designed to win a war of numbers, reliability, and relentless pressure. The Germans didn't fully realize this yet, but they would soon learn in the most brutal way possible when the Allies came crashing into Normandy. To understand why German generals were so dismissive, you have to look at the mindset of the Wehrmacht in the early years of the war. Blitzkrieg had made them overconfident. Their Panzer III and IV tanks had conquered France in 6 weeks. Their armor had crushed Soviet divisions in the early stages of Operation Barbarossa. They believed their designs were superior because they had results to prove it. Even when the Soviets rolled out the T-34, shocking the Germans with its sloped armor and mobility, Berlin responded with bigger monsters, the Tiger and Panther. For the German high command, tank warfare meant quality over quantity. The Americans, however, were playing a different game. From the very beginning, U.S. war planners understood that the battlefield of World War II wasn't going to be decided by who had the thickest armor or the largest gun. It was going to be decided by who could keep their machines running, who could keep them supplied, and who could flood the battlefield with overwhelming force. The M4 Sherman, introduced in 1942, reflected this philosophy. On paper, it wasn't impressive. Its 75mm gun could handle lighter German tanks, but against a Panther or a Tiger, it struggled. Its armor was only 50mm thick in places, no match for the devastating 88mm guns. And yes, its tendency to catch fire after being hit was real, at least in the early versions. German tank crews knew this, and so they laughed. But what they didn't see was the bigger picture. The Sherman could be built fast, faster than any Panther or Tiger. It was easy to transport across oceans, easy to repair in the field, and easy for crews to learn to operate. By 1944, the United States was producing nearly 2,000 Shermans a month. Compare that to Germany, which could barely push out 600 Panthers or Tigers in the same period, and you begin to see the storm that was brewing. As the Allies planned Operation Overlord, the massive invasion of France, the Sherman would be at the heart of the strategy. It wasn't about one Sherman against one Tiger. It was about 10 Shermans against one Tiger. It was about the fact that even if a Sherman was knocked out, another could take its place within hours. The German generals failed to account for this reality. In their arrogance, they were preparing for a duel. The Americans were preparing for an avalanche. And so, in the spring of 1944, as German generals joked in their command posts about the rolling coffins the Americans would surely bring, thousands of Shermans were quietly being loaded onto ships in England. Their crews were training tirelessly, their mechanics rehearsing field repairs, their logistics officers ensuring fuel and ammunition would flow like water. The Germans thought they were facing a laughingstock. What they were actually facing was an industrial juggernaut. And when the first wave of Shermans rolled off the landing craft into the hedgerows of Normandy, the laughter of the German generals would quickly die out. Because in the end, the Sherman wasn't just a tank. It was a symbol of America's greatest weapon in World War II. Not the biggest gun, not the thickest armor, but the ability to produce, supply, and sustain an endless tide of war machines until the enemy simply broke under the weight. And in Normandy, that tide was about to come crashing in. The dawn of June 6th, 1944, D-Day, arrived with thunder. The beaches of Normandy were about to witness the largest amphibious invasion in human history. Allied troops poured onto the sand under a storm of German gunfire, and behind them, waiting offshore, was the backbone of America's armored assault, the M4 Sherman. But if the Sherman was to prove itself, this was going to be its greatest test yet. The German defenders were dug in, their bunkers bristling with machine guns and artillery. Worse still, they had hidden their panzers, ready to strike when the Allies tried to push inland. In the mind of German generals, this was where the Sherman would be exposed. Surely, they thought, these weak American tanks would never survive the hedgerows of France, where every turn could hide a tiger waiting in ambush. The first wave of Shermans faced almost impossible odds. Some of them were special amphibious versions, equipped with flotation skirts that allowed them to swim ashore. Many didn't make it, the waves were too high, and the tanks sank before they could even reach the sand. On Omaha Beach, American infantry were pinned down, desperately needing armored support. The German defenders laughed as the sea swallowed tank after tank. To them, it was confirmation. The Sherman was nothing but a failure. But what they didn't see was that enough Shermans did make it. Enough to give the American troops cover, enough to punch holes in the German defenses, enough to start the slow grind inland. The Sherman wasn't elegant, it wasn't invincible, but it was there, reliable, steady, and crucially, replaceable. Where one tank was destroyed, another was already waiting on the ships offshore. As the Allies pushed past the beaches and into the hedgerows of Normandy, the Germans prepared their counterattack. This was the moment they had been waiting for. Rommel himself had argued that the best way to defeat the invasion was to crush it at the shoreline, using Germany's armored divisions to drive the Allies back into the sea. Now, with the Panzerlehr Division and elements of the 21st Panzer Division rolling forward, German commanders were confident. And why wouldn't they be? Their Tigers and Panthers were fearsome machines. A single Tiger could knock out a Sherman at over a mile away. A Panther's sloped armor was nearly impervious to the Sherman's 75mm gun. On paper, it wasn't even a contest. German tank crews bragged that facing a Sherman was like hunting rabbits with a rifle. But war isn't fought on paper. The Germans were about to learn that the battlefield is not just about technology. It's about logistics, numbers, and the sheer weight of relentless pressure. The hedgerows of Normandy became a nightmare. Each was like a natural fortress, dense walls of earth and vegetation that turned every field into a death trap. Shermans and Panzers clashed at close range, often less than 200 yards apart. The losses were staggering on both sides. A Tiger might take out 3 or 4 Shermans, but then it would break down, run out of fuel, or simply be overwhelmed by sheer numbers. For every Sherman destroyed, 2 more seemed to appear. American engineers quickly adapted, welding metal teeth onto the front of Shermans to rip through the hedgerows. Crews learned to call in artillery and airstrikes to cover their advances. The Sherman wasn't just a tank anymore. It was part of a combined arms machine, supported by infantry, planes, and endless supply lines. German generals grew frustrated. They had expected an easy slaughter. Instead, their prized tanks were being bogged down in endless battles of attrition. Worse still, Germany simply couldn't keep up with the losses. Every Tiger that was destroyed represented months of work and scarce resources. Every Sherman that was destroyed was replaced within days, sometimes within hours. One German officer later admitted, it was like trying to fight the tide with a bucket. No matter how many Shermans they destroyed, more came. They were everywhere, in the fields, on the roads, pushing through the villages. To the German high command, it was a shocking revelation. The Americans had turned war into an assembly line, and their tanks were the proof. By late June, the laughter in Berlin had gone silent. Reports from the front described wave after wave of Shermans pouring into Normandy, backed by relentless Allied air power. German commanders still mocked the Sherman's weaknesses, but privately, they were alarmed. The tank they had once ridiculed was now the backbone of a steamroller they couldn't stop. The Sherman wasn't winning battles because it was the best tank. It was winning because it was always there, always moving forward, always being replaced. And in the mud and blood of Normandy, German generals began to realize the truth. The Sherman didn't need to be superior. It only needed to be enough, and in numbers, it was more than enough. The tide of war had begun to turn, and the sound of Sherman tracks grinding through the French countryside was the sound of German arrogance being crushed underfoot. By July of 1944, the situation in Normandy had reached a breaking point. The Allies had secured their beachheads, but progress inland was agonizingly slow. The Germans had turned every hedgerow, every farmhouse, and every small village into a fortress. For the American infantry, every advance felt like pushing into a meat grinder. And yet, despite these brutal conditions, the Sherman tank was becoming more and more central to the fight. German commanders continued to scoff at the Sherman's shortcomings. Reports from the front lines described how a single Tiger tank could halt an entire column of Shermans. To the Germans, this was proof of their superiority. "A Tiger is worth 10 Shermans," one officer famously remarked. And in terms of raw firepower and armor, he wasn't wrong. But what he failed to understand was the bigger picture. The Sherman didn't fight alone. It fought as part of an army that seemed to have limitless resources. For every Tiger, there might be a dozen Shermans. For every destroyed Sherman, another rolled off the production line back in Detroit, arriving weeks later in France. German industry simply couldn't compete. By mid-1944, the Reich was struggling to replace its lost tanks. Factories were being bombed relentlessly by Allied air raids, raw materials were scarce, and skilled labor was running dry. On the battlefield, this imbalance became painfully clear. The Germans might win tactical victories, destroying dozens of Shermans in a single engagement, but strategically, they were losing. The Allies could replace their losses, the Germans could not. Every destroyed Tiger was irreplaceable. Every broken Panther was another gap in the defensive line. But beyond numbers, something else was happening, a psychological shift. At first, American crews had been intimidated by the sight of a Tiger or a Panther. They knew their Sherman's 75mm gun often couldn't penetrate German armor head-on. Tank battles could be terrifying, with crews realizing that if they met a Tiger on open ground, they were often doomed. Yet, as the campaign wore on, Sherman crews began to adapt. They learned to use terrain to their advantage, ambushing German tanks from the side or rear, where their armor was weaker. They coordinated with artillery, using smoke barges to blind the enemy. They called in Thunderbolt fighter bombers to strike whenever a Tiger revealed its position. And crucially, they worked together. One Sherman alone might fall easily to a Tiger, but 4 Shermans attacking in unison could overwhelm even the most powerful German machine. It wasn't about one-on-one duels. It was about teamwork, persistence, and the relentless pressure of Allied tactics. This was something the Germans had underestimated. Meanwhile, German generals were beginning to feel the strain. The Allies had brought not just tanks, but an entire machine of war to France. Supply lines stretched from the beaches directly into the heart of Normandy. Convoys of trucks carried fuel, ammunition, and spare parts. Mobile repair depots worked around the clock to get damaged Shermans back into battle. For the Germans, whose supply system was collapsing under constant air attack, this level of efficiency was staggering. By the middle of July, the Sherman was everywhere. They weren't just pushing through the hedgerows, they were supporting infantry in towns, escorting convoys, and forming armored spearheads for the eventual breakout. German soldiers who had once mocked the Tommy Cooker, as they derisively called it, now spoke with frustration about how the Shermans just kept coming. One German diary entry captured the sentiment. "They burn easily, but there are always more. Always more." This relentless pressure began to wear down even the most hardened German formations. The panzer divisions, once feared as the sharp edge of Hitler's war machine, were being ground down in battle after battle. The elite 12th SS Panzer Division, composed of fanatical young soldiers, was battered so badly that it never fully recovered. Panzer Lehr, considered one of Germany's best-trained and best-equipped units, was reduced to a shadow of its former strength. And all the while, the Sherman kept rolling forward. Its reputation among Allied troops was changing too. At first, many American soldiers had cursed the Sherman for being underpowered, for catching fire when hit, for not standing up to the German giants. But by July, they had begun to appreciate its true strength. It started when they realized that no matter how many were destroyed, replacements always arrived. They realized that the Sherman was easy to repair, easy to drive, and reliable in the mud and dust of Normandy. Most importantly, they realized that when they called for tank support, the Shermans came. The German generals, who had once laughed at the thought of American tanks, were no longer laughing. They were confronting a terrifying reality. The Sherman wasn't designed to be perfect. It was designed to be enough, and to exist in such overwhelming numbers that perfection didn't matter. The lessons of Normandy were brutal and unrelenting. It wasn't about who had the best tank. It was about who had the most tanks, who could keep fighting when the other side could not. And in that contest, the Sherman was proving to be the ultimate weapon, not by virtue of superiority, but by the sheer force of American industrial might. Normandy had become a grinding contest of attrition, and the Sherman, mock though it was emerging as the tank that could outlast Germany's best. The laughter of German generals was fading, replaced by grim recognition. This war was being won not just on the battlefield, but in the factories across the Atlantic. By late July 1944, the Allies were preparing for a breakout from Normandy. For weeks they had been bogged down in the brutal hedgerow fighting, suffering heavy casualties, but now the tide was about to shift. The Sherman tank, once ridiculed, was about to play a central role in one of the most decisive operations of the entire war, Operation Cobra. The plan was simple in concept, but devastating in execution. Instead of inching forward through the hedgerows, the Allies would unleash an overwhelming aerial bombardment, followed by a concentrated armored thrust. This would punch a hole through the German lines, allowing Allied forces to break into open country, where their superior mobility and numbers could finally be unleashed. The Sherman was tailor-made for this kind of warfare. While it struggled in close-range duels with Tigers and Panthers, it excelled in fast, mobile advances. Its lighter weight made it easier to maneuver on the narrow French roads. Its mechanical reliability meant that long drives across difficult terrain were possible. Most importantly, there were thousands of them ready and waiting for the breakout. On July 25th, Operation Cobra began. The skies over Normandy filled with Allied bombers, thousands of them. The bombardment was so intense that entire German units were obliterated before they could even respond. When the smoke cleared, the Sherman tanks surged forward, spearheading the breakout. German generals, who had mocked the Sherman's thin armor and modest firepower, now watched in horror as wave after wave of these inferior tanks poured through the gap. What the Shermans lacked in individual strength, they made up for with sheer momentum. The German defenses, already battered by weeks of combat and the relentless bombing, simply couldn't hold. 4 German tank crews. The experience was terrifying. They might destroy a Sherman or 2, but before they could reload, 3 more appeared. Their vaunted Tigers, while powerful, were slow and mechanically unreliable. Many broke down before they could even reach the battlefield. Those that did make it often found themselves cut off, surrounded, and destroyed by swarms of Shermans, supported by infantry and aircraft. One German tank commander described the nightmare. The Shermans come in endless columns. You destroy one, and another takes its place. They do not stop. It is as if America has found a way to make war without limits. This was the moment when German generals began to truly grasp the scale of American industrial might. They had expected a repeat of 1940, when German armor had swept through France with lightning speed. Instead, they found themselves on the receiving end of a mechanized juggernaut that dwarfed even their boldest offensives. The breakout from Normandy was rapid and devastating. Within days, Shermans were advancing deep into the French countryside. German forces, unable to regroup, were trapped in what became known as the Falaise Pocket, a massive encirclement that destroyed much of the German army in France. Over 50,000 German soldiers were killed or captured, and countless vehicles, including their prized tanks, were abandoned. The Sherman, mocked at the start of the campaign, had become the symbol of Allied momentum. German officers could no longer laugh at it. Instead, they feared it, not because of what it was individually, but because of what it represented, America's ability to wage total war. In the aftermath of the breakout, German intelligence reports became increasingly desperate. They noted that the Allies seemed to have an inexhaustible supply of tanks. Even when entire battalions of Shermans were destroyed, replacements appeared almost immediately. For the Germans, who struggled to build even a handful of Panthers or Tigers each month, this was a crushing realization. Meanwhile, for Allied soldiers, the Sherman was gaining respect. Infantrymen who had once cursed its vulnerability now praised it as their lifeline. When pinned down, they knew the Shermans would come. When advancing, they knew the Shermans would lead the way. The tank had become not just a weapon, but a constant presence on the battlefield, an assurance that they were never fighting alone. By August, the German army in France was in full retreat. The Allies were sweeping across the country, liberating towns and villages as they went. And everywhere, the Sherman was at the forefront. Its silhouette, once ridiculed, was now burned into the minds of German soldiers as the unstoppable face of American power. German generals had once laughed at the Sherman, dismissing it as a toy compared to their mighty Tigers. But in Normandy, they had learned the harshest truth of war. It isn't the best machine that wins. It's the machine that can be built in overwhelming numbers, maintained in the field, and used relentlessly until the enemy breaks. The Sherman was proving that lesson every single day. As the Allies surged forward after the breakout, the Sherman's reputation continued to evolve. German generals had underestimated not only the tank itself, but the entire system that supported it. What made the Sherman so effective was not just its presence on the battlefield, but the vast logistical machine behind it. A machine Germany could never hope to match. By mid-August 1944, the Allies were advancing at a speed that stunned both friend and foe. Entire German divisions were collapsing under the weight of relentless pressure. The key to this advance was mobility, and mobility depended on tanks. The Sherman, with its reliable engine and standardized parts, was the perfect tool for the job. German officers watching this advance were horrified. They had been taught that wars were won by superior weapons and brilliant tactics. But here they were facing an enemy who proved that wars could also be won by reliability, supply, and mass production. The Shermans did not need to be better than Tigers or Panthers. They only needed to be good enough, and available in numbers so vast that German superiority in firepower and armor meant nothing. American industry had delivered that in spades. By 1944, the United States was producing more Shermans every month than Germany could produce tanks in half a year. And unlike the German war machine, which often relied on forced labor and scarce resources, the American system ran smoothly, efficiently, and with endless reserves of fuel, steel, and manpower. One German general later admitted with bitter respect, the Sherman was not the best tank of the war, but it was the tank of the war. It was everywhere, always in greater numbers, always supported, always repaired. Against such an enemy, what could we do? The Falaise Pocket had shown the devastating consequences of this imbalance. Thousands of German vehicles, including their precious tanks, were lost in the encirclement. In contrast, the Allies could afford to replace every Sherman destroyed. American supply ships unloaded tanks in French ports almost daily. If a Sherman was knocked out, another was waiting on a dock, ready to roll inland within hours. This was an entirely new kind of warfare, industrial warfare on a scale the Germans had never imagined. They had thought of tanks as rare, elite weapons, to be deployed sparingly and with precision. The Americans treated them as consumables, tools to be used, lost, and replaced without hesitation. German soldiers noticed the difference. Where their tank crews nursed each Panther or Tiger as if it were irreplaceable, American crews fought with the confidence that reinforcements were always behind them. This psychological edge was just as important as any technological advantage. In town after town, villagers cheered as columns of Shermans rolled through, liberating them from occupation. For the people of France, the Sherman became the image of freedom. Its rounded turret and steady rumble were signals that the nightmare was ending. Children ran alongside, offering flowers and waving flags. To the Allies, the Sherman was more than a tank. It was a symbol of hope. The Germans, however, saw it differently. For them, the Sherman was a nightmare made real. Wherever they turned, the tank was there. In the fields, in the villages, on the roads, in the forests. It was impossible to escape its presence. Even when they destroyed dozens, more kept coming. It was like fighting a tide that could never be turned back, and the nightmare was only growing. By August 1944, the Allies had landed not just thousands, but tens of thousands of Shermans in Europe. German generals who once mocked it as weak now spoke of it with grim respect. They knew that even their best tanks, even their most seasoned crews, could not withstand the sheer mass of steel America was pouring onto the continent. The difference in philosophy was stark. Germany had pursued the perfect tank. Heavily armored, heavily armed, technically advanced, but expensive, difficult to maintain, and produced in tiny numbers. America had chosen a different path. A tank that was simple, reliable, versatile, and above all, mass-producible. In the brutal reality of war, it was the American philosophy that proved correct. The Sherman was not about dueling with tigers. It was about sustaining momentum, keeping the army moving, and ensuring that every infantryman had armored support. It was about overwhelming the enemy with such force that resistance became futile. By the time Allied forces approached the Seine River, the German army in France was broken. Hitler demanded counterattacks that were impossible to launch. His generals, exhausted and demoralized, could only watch as wave after wave of Shermans pressed forward. They had once laughed at the tank. Now they could only curse it, because for all its supposed weaknesses, the Sherman was doing what no German tank could. It was winning the war. By the summer of 1944, the Normandy battlefield had turned into a proving ground, not only for weapons and tactics, but also for the psychology of war. The German generals who once scoffed at the Sherman as a rolling coffin now faced an undeniable reality. The Allies had mastered the art of overwhelming presence. Numbers mattered, but so did perception. And the Sherman tank, with its constant visibility across the front, began to gnaw at the German psyche in ways even the mighty Tiger could not counter. For months, German propaganda had painted the Sherman as weak, poorly armored, and no match for German steel. Tank crews were told they would cut through them with ease, like a knife through butter. And in one-on-one duels, that was often true. A Panther or Tiger on favorable ground could destroy Shermans at ranges where the American crews could not even fire back. But in the hedgerows and villages of Normandy, the battle rarely unfolded as a duel. Shermans arrived in groups, supported by infantry, artillery, and aircraft. A German Tiger might destroy 2, even 3 Shermans in quick succession, but then more would appear. Another platoon rolled into the same field. Another column advanced down the road. Each destroyed Sherman seemed instantly replaced by 2 more. German officers began to realize the terrifying truth. They were not just fighting a tank, they were fighting a system. The Sherman was more than a machine. It was the centerpiece of a vast industrial and logistical chain, stretching back across the Atlantic to American factories that never seemed to sleep. Where a destroyed Panther meant weeks of repair and scarce parts, a destroyed Sherman meant nothing more than a requisition form. By dawn the next day, a new tank might already be on its way. This relentless replenishment created a psychological pressure German forces had rarely experienced before. In the east, they had faced Soviet swarms, but the T-34s were rough, and the Red Army often suffered staggering losses to achieve a breakthrough. Here in Normandy, the Americans advanced with precision, coordination, and a logistical backbone that felt endless. German generals began muttering in their field reports, "We destroy the Shermans, yet more come. Always more." The psychological weight fell heaviest on the tank crews themselves. Imagine being a German gunner in a Panther, scanning a hedgerow at dusk. You see one Sherman crawl into view, you fire, destroy it, and watch the flames rise. But then, before the smoke clears, another appears. Then another. Suddenly, you are not the hunter. You are the hunted. The Americans had developed a chillingly effective tactic: swarming. If a Panther destroyed the lead Sherman, the others would maneuver to flank it. If one was lost, the others pressed forward, firing smoke rounds, calling in air support, forcing the German crew to fight under constant pressure. The Tiger might be invincible on paper, but a single tank cannot hold off a pack forever. And German crews began to dread the sound, the rumble of multiple Shermans advancing at once. Not one, not two, but entire lines of them, coming relentlessly, like a steel tide rolling over the countryside. Even German generals, far from the front, began to note the shift. Reports came in describing not just tactical defeats, but a growing sense of helplessness. One staff officer recorded, "Our tanks can win battles, but the enemy's factories win wars." It was a grim realization. The Sherman was no longer seen as a laughable opponent. It was a symbol of Allied endurance, a reminder that Germany, no matter how tactically brilliant, was being crushed under the sheer weight of production and supply. American crews felt this too. They knew the Germans still outclassed them one-on-one, but they drew confidence from their numbers, their support, and their mission. Shermans rolled into villages with infantry on their flanks, engineers clearing roads, and artillery already sighted in behind them. This cohesion, this constant presence, wore down even the most disciplined German defenders. And when German generals gathered in their war rooms, poring over maps, the laughter that once greeted the Sherman's name had long since vanished. Now they spoke with tight jaws and narrowed eyes. The Sherman had become not a joke, but a nightmare, because it symbolized what Germany could not match: the industrial machine of the United States. By the end of July, as the Allies prepared for their breakout from Normandy, the psychological war was already tilting. The Sherman had proven something profound. Even a so-called inferior tank, when multiplied by the thousands and backed by a relentless supply chain, could shatter the confidence of an enemy who once thought themselves untouchable. And so, with every mile the Shermans advanced, the myth of German superiority cracked a little more. The battlefield was changing, not through the might of a single tank, but through the unstoppable weight of many. The summer of 1944 was not only the turning point of the war in Western Europe, it was the stage where the Sherman tank shed its reputation as a clumsy machine and became the very symbol of Allied momentum. What German generals once dismissed as laughable had now become their greatest frustration. The Sherman was not a tiger, it was not a panther. It was not meant to inspire awe in duels across vast fields. Its genius lay elsewhere, in its ability to keep rolling, keep advancing, and keep multiplying when every other nation's war machine struggled to keep pace. As the Allies broke through the hedgerows of Normandy in Operation Cobra, the sheer presence of Shermans on the battlefield began to resemble a tide. Villages once considered impregnable strongholds were swallowed by columns of green tanks, their white stars painted boldly on the hulls, grinding forward in an unending stream. 4 German soldiers crouched in their bunkers. The sight was crushing. They could hear the engines before they saw them, the steady rhythm of dozens of Shermans moving in unison. They could destroy a handful, yes, but for every tank they stopped, another column pushed through. The roads of Normandy were alive with Shermans, like veins pumping the lifeblood of Allied power across France. One German officer remarked bitterly, "The enemy does not fight with tanks. He fights with factories." This relentless advance exposed the truth that had been hiding in plain sight. Wars are not won by single machines, no matter how powerful. Wars are won by systems, by supply chains, coordination, and the will to keep fighting. The Sherman was the living embodiment of that truth. Every time a Sherman was knocked out, salvage crews recovered what they could. Mechanics patched others back together, and replacements rolled off the landing craft to take their place. It was a cycle that Germany could never hope to match, where a destroyed Tiger meant weeks of repair and the loss of irreplaceable resources. A destroyed Sherman was little more than a temporary inconvenience. The Allies had built a war machine designed for endurance, not spectacle. And it was endurance, not spectacle, that would decide Normandy. The German generals, once so confident, now faced a grim reality. Their vaunted Tigers and Panthers could still dominate individual duels, but they were increasingly irrelevant in the face of Allied numbers. A Tiger crew might kill 10 Shermans, but by the time the last shell was fired, they found themselves surrounded, outflanked, and alone. The laughter that had greeted the Sherman in the early years of the war was long gone. In its place was a reluctant respect, and beneath that respect, a growing dread. For every Tiger produced, the Allies could field 10 Shermans. For every Panther, 20. And those Shermans came not just with numbers, but with a strategy. American and British forces had perfected combined arms, tanks working with infantry, artillery, engineers, and above all, Air power. Even the most powerful German tanks were helpless when swarmed from multiple sides and bombarded from above. The Sherman was never supposed to fight alone, and in that it was unmatched. By August 1944, as Paris prepared for liberation, the tide of Shermans rolling across France had become unstoppable. What began as a trickle on the beaches of Normandy had turned into a flood sweeping across the countryside. For the German generals, it was a bitter lesson. They had placed their faith in might, monstrous machines like the Tiger, technological marvels meant to dominate through fear. But in the end, it was not fear that won the war. It was persistence. It was numbers. It was the simple, reliable, and relentless Sherman. The war would not end in Normandy. Battles still raged across Europe, and countless lives would still be lost before the final surrender. But the psychological shift had already occurred. The Sherman had transformed in the eyes of friend and foe alike. No longer a laughingstock, no longer a coffin, but the very image of Allied power rolling toward victory. When German generals spoke of it now, it was not with laughter. It was with grim acknowledgement. They had underestimated it, and in doing so, they had underestimated the force of an enemy who understood that wars are not decided by the sharpness of a single blade, but by the weight of the entire hammer that wields it. And so the story of the Sherman is not the story of the biggest or the strongest. It is the story of the tank that kept moving, kept fighting, and kept appearing when it was needed most. A tank that carried not only men, but the hopes of an entire alliance on its tracks. The Germans laughed once, but in the end, it was the laughter that died out first, because when the fields of Normandy shook with the roar of thousands of Shermans, the joke was over, and the war was already slipping from their hands.